Well, good morning and happy Friday the 13th, this 13th of May. This is our data science and data reuse seminar. It's a pleasure to host these seminar series from the Office of Data Science Strategy. I'm Susan Gregorick. I'm the Associate Director of Data Science, and we host the seminars each month to learn about the data science sharing and reuse opportunities within our institutes and centers. The next slide if you don't mind moving to the, thank you, just shows you the QR code where you can interact with us via the Slido app. We like to encourage all researchers to share and reuse data. This is an opportunity to hear the success of researchers to share their stories about data sharing and data reuse. And as I said, it's a time for you to hear about what our institutes and centers are doing to promote data science sharing programs and new opportunities. The next slide is just a test to run Slido. You can log on to slido.com with the number as you see there and tell us where you're joining from. All of our questions for our speaker today are in the question and answer tab of Slido so that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our speaker in a moderated session. The next slide is just a few opportunities for you to engage NIH in our data science activities. If you are going to ISMB this July, we'll be hosting a one-day panel meeting on our Smart and Connected Health program. It's a partnership with the National Institutes of Health. You'll hear featured talks from PIs who have been awarded through this program. We'll have a mock review session and a panel discussion. We're also sponsoring a bioinformatics open source conference, a BOSC, that is held in conjunction with ISMB. Late poster submissions are open until May 19th if you're interested. Our next slide is a call for action for you to join NIH as a national data scholar. This program brings colleagues from industry, from academia, and from nonprofits and other federal agencies to work for 1 or 2 years as a sabbatical here at NIH. You'll be working on really challenging and hard problems, such as how do you create a data ecosystem for pandemic preparedness, all the way down to how do you improve interoperability for eye health data, something that I'm sure is of great interest to the community today. So if you're interested in joining NIH for a 1 to 2 year sabbatical, please do get your application in. They're due on May 27th, and we have 9 openings for scholars this year. The next slide is just an FYI for the research community. We are engaging up to 20 early career researchers to actively participate in our AIM Ahead program. AIM Ahead is our artificial intelligence and machine learning program to advance health equality and address health disparities. The applications for the fellowships are due on September 1st. You'll have access to the AIM Ahead data, including OCHAN's advanced EHR infrastructure. You'll be matched with mentors. You'll be provided both AIM Ahead and institutional mentors. There'll be stipends for fellows, as well as other great activities. On the next slide, if you would like to be a mentor for the AIM Ahead program, please do connect with AIM Ahead Connects. It's a mentoring mentee networking program to provide professional development and to connect across the AIM Ahead consortium. We're really interested in mentoring groups and projects. We'll do project-based research. We'll look at publications. We'll help with CV and resume builders and even more. So if you're interested in connecting with AIM Ahead, do look at the AIM Ahead Connects opportunity. And the last announcement from my side is our DataWorks challenge. We are partnering with FASEB. We'll be providing up to 12 monetary prizes, recognizing teams who participate in the prize to tell us how they're sharing their data and how they're reusing data. So the entries are already open. They close on July 19th. If you're interested to learn more about this, there's a lot of information both on the FASEB, the Office of Data Science Strategy websites, as well as in the HeroX platform. The next slide is just to tell you that on June 10th, we'll be hosting Dr. Rosa Alcazar. She is a grantee of NHGRI, the National Human Genome Research Institute. She'll be talking about her work in diversifying genomics data science research communities and her approaches to democratizing the access of data. So I hope that you'll join us to hear Dr. Alcazar's work. And with that, I am going to introduce my colleague, Dr. Carrie Goetz. She's a health service researcher, and she's also the Associate Director for the National Eye Institute's Office of Data Science and Health Informatics. She's responsible for advancing data management and sharing strategies to make the National Eye Institute's data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. For over a decade, Carrie has been leading in the iGene program. It's a controlled access data resource that has data, samples, and patient registries for rare eye conditions. So with that, Carrie, thank you so much for moderating today. I'd love to hear more about the work in the National Eye Institute and, of course, our excellent speaker.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. I was asked to just share a couple slides, so let me do this real quick. Hopefully everyone can see this okay. So again, my name is Carrie Goetz, and I lead a relatively new office at the NEI for data science and health informatics. So that everyone is aware, the NEI released a strategic plan not too long ago. And within that plan, data science was identified as one of the 7 cross-cutting areas of emphasis. Within that plan, we recognized the need to facilitate storage and creation of big data, develop opportunities in AI, and promote training and workforce development, as well as building on the computational advances that already exist in vision research. So we've been doing this in a variety of ways for the past year. A few things, we all know that the data management and sharing policy will be implemented very soon, but a lot of people do still feel like that is a stick. So we wanted to create some incentives for data sharing, or carrots. So one of the things that the NEI and the Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology pushed for was to create a new data publication type in the journal TVST. And we hope that this will gradually shift the culture to incentivize data sharing and more team science by giving opportunity for academic credit, findability, and citations. We've also been identifying ways to create more terminology development in health and vision health space, vision and eye health space. And we have recently launched an OMOP working group, OMOP Odyssey working group for that, in collaboration with the American Academy of Ophthalmology. And this is definitely a team science space. It's the NEI working with a lot of individuals in both science and clinical care. Intramurally, we've been sensitizing people to the need for data sharing and the benefits of that through several intramural retreats. And just as an example, at our last retreat, we ran some breakout groups that involved topics that the intramural folks had identified, such as like, what's your data management and sharing experience, how to incentivize from their own perspective data sharing, even down to how to manage animal imaging data and data storage options on-prem. Just recently, we've been involved in advancing imaging standards. Earlier this year, we released an RFI, and you can read the executive summary at Zenodo. This week, we had a FDA, ONC, NEI joint workshop to promote adoption of ocular imaging standards. This workshop included 30 panelists and over 280 participants, and the outcome of that was that the NEI, the Office of the National Coordinator, and the FDA, all 3 committed to using whatever levers possible that they had to improve interoperability in ocular imaging. We also committed to revamping the DICOM Working Group 9, which is focused on standards for ocular imaging. There'll be a white paper coming out and hopefully some connect-a-thons to showcase validating interoperability in ocular imaging. And as Susan already mentioned, we have a data scholar position available at the NEI, and this person will work with both the NEI Office of Data Science and Health Informatics, as well as that AAO working group on ocular standards. And just wanted to wrap up by introducing my team. We're a lean, mean fighting machine of 3 folks, but we're growing in all of the aspects that we're tackling. We have a lot of projects, as you can see, happening, and we're very committed to making data sharing the status quo practice. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over by introducing Jayashree Kalpathy-Kramer. And she is currently the Associate Professor of Radiology at the Harvard Medical School and a co-director of the QTIM Lab and the Center for Machine Learning at the Martineau Center. She's the incoming chief of the new Division of Artificial Medicine Intelligence in Ophthalmology and the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She's an electrical engineer by training and has worked in semiconductor industry for several years. After returning to academia, she's now focused on applications of machine learning and modeling in healthcare. Her research interests include medical imaging analysis, machine learning and artificial intelligence for applications in radiology, oncology, and ophthalmology. And her work spans the spectrum from novel algorithm development to clinical deployment. She's passionate about the potential of these techniques have to improve access to healthcare in the US and worldwide, and has authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications and written over a dozen book chapters. So welcome, Jayashree, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. So thank you for inviting me here and providing me the opportunity to share my perspective on the very critical need for high quality data in this era of machine learning and AI. Data sharing really is so very important to many of us who are working to create robust machine learning algorithms, and especially in high stakes domain like medicine. We all know that AI has gone through many peaks and troughs and has had many incarnations. Much of what we call AI today tends to be based on the applications of deep neural networks. These approaches have been phenomenally successful in many, many computer science and language tasks. But one thing to note about these approaches is that they're extremely data hungry. So data is really, really at the core of all of what we do today. And the ability to access high quality data is really what propels our research. Some disclosures, and as mentioned, a personal update. Sorry. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to share some of our experiences with AI and data science for a variety of medical imaging tasks. We've been working very closely with clinical colleagues in radiology, oncology, and ophthalmology to develop and deploy what we hope are really clinically useful solutions. And as we progress beyond a publication to real-life implementation, many of the lessons that we have learned, sometimes quite painfully, have to do a lot with data, both the quality and the quantity. Specifically, the need for a diverse, well-curated, multi-institutional data set cannot really be emphasized enough. We'll walk through some of the ways in which we've worked on getting access to these multi-institutional data sets. However, data sharing has many challenges. And although we don't necessarily like to acknowledge it, sometimes data sharing can actually cause some more harm than good. So I really hope that we can have a fruitful discussion at the end about what both the need and also the challenges associated with data sharing in the context of development of AI for medical applications. So here are some of the recent research that we've done in the area of applying AI and ML to medical imaging in a variety of domains. And you can see applications in ophthalmology, radiology, oncology. And in all of these applications, really, our work depends on the generosity of our clinical collaborators. Without their data and without their clinical expertise, we really would not be in a position to do a lot of this meaningful research. As data scientists and AI technical folk, we really, really depend on the generosity of our clinical collaborators. And data sharing, again, is fundamental to that work. We've been fortunate to take advantage of many of the NIH-funded opportunities that enable both data sharing as well as infrastructure building. The I've been fortunate again to have a couple of the R21s for secondary data analysis in vision research. And this has, again, allowed us to do a lot more with the data that was originally collected for instance, for the clinical trials and so on. We've also been fortunate to get support from the ITCR program through NCI, and that has allowed us to build the infrastructure that allows us to then consume the data and worry about data harmonization and data standards and all of the things that are necessary to make the data usable. In the COVID era, we've been working as part of MIDRC to, again, develop tools that can help with the data. And the MIDRC program is a wonderful medical imaging resource. Primarily to date has been focused on collecting COVID-related data sets, but hopefully will expand to other data sets in the future as well. And as mentioned, the many of the programs coming out of the data science office are very exciting to us, again, from the data science perspective. So taking a sort of brief step back, I just wanted to touch upon how people think about what modern AI is and how it might differ from some of the past incarnations. So more traditionally, we had the notion of you have a data, you have a program, you feed them into a computer and get out an output. But what we tend to see today with a lot of the more deep learning based approaches is that essentially you have a lot of data and you have some output that you want to derive from those data, and you feed those into the computer, and what comes out is not an output, but a program. So essentially you've taken all the data that you have and converted it into code or a program. An example of this was a slide that Dr. Dreyer at MGH had put together. So for instance, if you're trying to create a classifier for mountains, you might have lots of examples from your own photographs or from the web in terms of what constitutes a mountain. You take thousands and thousands of these examples of what's a mountain, what's not a mountain, and you start off with a neural network, and essentially you just point the network to these examples. And as you continue to train, you get an algorithm or a trained model that can now be used to classify unseen new images. And a lot of what we tend to see today in the deep learning era, even in medicine and medical imaging in NLP, tends to be similar to that. So you start off with lots and lots of positive and negative examples. You point your machine learning algorithm to these labeled data set, and what you get is a trained algorithm. In fact, somebody, the NVIDIA CEO famously said that your data is your company's source code. So I think we can all really understand that the value of the data, as we are in this era where we use the big data, we use deep learning methods, we use many of the AI methods, all of which depend on having access to a lot of data. Unfortunately, we also know that if the data are biased, what comes out can also be biased. And there are some very famous examples of AI going wrong. And they happen not just in the imaging field, but more broadly in social sciences, in healthcare, broadly in terms of, or even in search engines and things like that. So one thing that we really need to be careful about as we're thinking about data sharing and making these public resources available is how do we ensure and how do we mitigate the problems that might arise because of some hidden biases in the data. So this is a theme that we'll touch upon throughout the talk, but I just wanted to highlight that even up front is that as we think about data being the code, we need to be very careful about what these data are. So deep learning is exceedingly popular in the medical literature today. If you just look at PubMed for the number of times deep learning on neural network shows up, you can see that neural networks showed up were pretty common in the 90s and early 2000s. But really starting from about 2015, we see a tremendous explosion of publications that use deep learning and neural networks. And one reason for that is they can be quite effective. They can be quite effective and they can be quite easy to train and develop. In fact, we've had high school students in our lab who come and work with us and have been able to develop really high quality algorithms without a whole lot of background in either the clinical domain or mathematics. They have very little background, in fact, in terms of calculus or any of the math that goes into these these algorithms, the statistics, the mathematics. It has become so easy right now, actually, because of this confluence of a variety of factors, including the software and sort of open community. All of what we do today is based on using these frameworks that have been developed and made public and open source by other people, not obviously everybody's, but most often the work that we do is building on these software frameworks that other people have developed and encoded and made publicly and available and made open source. We need a ton of data for this, and efforts in the vision community like ImageNet have really propelled the field forward, but also efforts within the NIH-funded opportunities in terms of the Cancer Imaging Archive or METRIC, again, are all really helping the field move forward. And of course, without the hardware, without the GPUs and the TPUs, we really wouldn't be in a position to do the kind of computation that is necessary today. Many of these algorithms have been around for 50 to 70 years, but the reason that they have become so popular today is that it's become much more tractable to use these algorithms in a realistic time frame to train them. And in fact, every year, these things are getting better and better. It also highlights some of the challenges that we have as academic researchers, in that we need access to tremendous computational resources, and that tends to be a challenge for many of us as well. It is getting very easy to create AI algorithms. There's some phenomenal work done by colleagues at Moorfields in the UK, where they use AutoML, for instance, to train image classification algorithms and this was done by healthcare professionals with no coding experience. And we see this notion of democratization of AI as a way in which many, many people can participate, and bringing in people from all levels, from high school students all the way to senior faculty, to develop these algorithms. But along with the ease that this has been allowed with these advances, come some of the challenges. So we're getting to the point essentially where we can take some data, we can take some annotations, we can take AutoML type frameworks, and out pops a trained model. We can also get to the point, and in fact it's happening now, is where you have another algorithm that essentially can write your abstract for you, and hopefully maybe it'll write your paper for you, and maybe it'll write your grant for you at some point too. But with the ease and by which all of this is happening, it still continues to be very difficult to create algorithms that are broad and general and robust and not biased and fair and self-aware, and know when they might need to be they might need to have oversight by humans experts, for instance. So in some ways, it's been phenomenal in that we have the ability to now create these algorithms relatively easily. But the same ease has also led to some challenges, because you might get some very impressive results very quickly, but then when you go to deploy it in the field, you have a lot of challenges that you have to deal with. One of the constraints is that we need lots of data for these algorithms. The computer vision field uses data sets that are in the millions and billions, but in medical imaging, we tend to have data sets that are in the tens to the hundreds to maybe the thousands. And that again limits the kind of robustness and generalization that we can do with these algorithms. So there are many challenges that we've come across as we are doing this and trying to deploy it in the field. And I'm just listing some of them here, and we'll go through some of the bolded ones in a second. So sometimes the models are not predictable. You take the same person, you image them twice in a very short order where there's no change in pathology, but the model outputs can flip-flop. One thing we see a lot is that the reported performance of models can be exceedingly over-optimistic. There's a lot of overfitting that happens either sort of inadvertently, there's leakage between the training and test sets, or many other ways in which overfitting can happen and can lead to sort of very over-optimistic results. The two things that I'd like to touch upon are the notion of portability. And here, essentially, the question is, are these models brittle? You can train them on a data set that came from a certain population, and that might be from a certain scanner type, certain image acquisition device, certain geography. But then when you try to apply it to a completely different data set, they don't work. This is somewhat known in the computer science literature, but the recognition of how brittle these are, it still seems to be a work in progress in terms of understanding in the medical domain. There's a lot of issues with calibration, the questions of gray zone, the lack of ground truth, silent failures where these models may fail with and be confidently wrong. So they may not essentially be able to tell the user when they're uncertain and just sort of give a wrong answer. And they can be biased, and this can be in really hard to detect ways as well. So trying to think about how the data perspective in terms of how can we think about the data sets and what their impact might be on some of these, I think is worth pursuing. So the brittleness of deep learning has been reported. Only 6% of published studies have external validation, and data heterogeneity can lead to poor performance on external data sets. Here's some really nice work that's an ongoing living document, but they looked at how many of the medical AI devices that have gone through the FDA approval process are, what data were used to create them. Do they have multi-site data sets? Do they use prospective validation? And unfortunately, I think, in my opinion, very few of them actually have done these multi-site prospective studies to see how robust and generalizable the algorithms are. The COVID era was an interesting use case. I think as a community, we all really, really wanted to help and do what we can when COVID sort of first came on the scene in 2020. And we saw an explosion of publications that had to do with using AI and COVID. And I think a lot of this genuinely came from a desire by the computer scientists and the data scientists to try to do something meaningful in this really critical problem. Unfortunately, what ended up having is they were not really well curated data sets of COVID positive patients, for instance, and there were very small number of limited data sets. On the other hand, the number of publications was extremely large. And many of these publications use data sets that were flawed in some ways. So in this particular review, and there were others subsequently that have looked at COVID-related publications, what they observed was really none of the models that were developed, and there were many, had any potential clinical use due to methodological flaws or underlying biases. And data was a big part of that. So one example of the kind of problem was this notion of Frankenstein data sets. And here, there was a particularly egregious example where they used a pediatric data set with pneumonia and an adult data set and tried to develop a classifier. And essentially what they noticed and what people observed, of course, was great performance because the algorithm was actually, in effect, separating pediatric x-rays from adult x-rays. Obviously, that is not the intention of the tool, but there was multiple publications that use this data set and showed great results. And there's a somewhat controversial statement, I think, which is we advise a caution of use of public repositories. On one hand, as a field, we are greatly supporting and encouraging people to make the data public. But some of the challenges with that are, if you don't have metadata about it, if the data sets are not well curated, if you don't know what their origin is, and just are made public, you might end up inadvertently causing some harm. So still thinking very carefully about how to make these data sets usable in a safe way, I think is something, again, as a community, I hope we can talk about. This has been said many times, garbage in, garbage out. And so we need to think carefully about not doing that. There's another challenge with data sets and deep learning specifically, which is data heterogeneity. If you have data at multiple institutions where the prevalence of the disease is different, or people are using different scanner types, or there are some hidden confounders. For instance, if the association between the pathology of interest and some shortcut finding is different in different subgroups, we can again see that the algorithms end up picking up spurious associations. And so thinking carefully about how these data sets are created and what potential there might be for hidden and unforeseen confounding factors is very important as well. So some of the use cases that we are working with are mammography. So in mammograms, of course, breast cancer screening is a very needed tool, and breast density is reported regularly when mammograms are read. Typically, it's classified into 4 grades, from fatty to extremely dense. And there's been a lot of inter-rater variation in the reported in the publications. So there's been interest in developing automated breast classification algorithms. Also in cervical cancer, tends to have a tremendous burden worldwide. There's limited access to effective cervical cancer screening tools out there. And so one of the things that we've been working with is developing automated tools for visual examination of the cervix. In all of these cases, again, we've been extremely fortunate to have clinical collaborators who've been very generous in sharing data and sharing the clinical questions and working closely with us throughout the process to make sure that the algorithms that we develop are useful and not biased, are actually solving a clinical need. The other area that, again, we've been working in for a number of years, working very closely with Dr. Michael Chang, the director of the NEI, as well as Pete Campbell of OHSU, is ROP. It's a disease affecting low birth weight babies, and it's a leading cause of preventable blindness worldwide. And there's a range of treatment options that are available if diagnosed early. And so the goal of a lot of the work we've been doing in the AI in ROP is to develop these algorithms that can be applied across the globe, essentially, to help with the diagnosis of disease, to help with the standardization and things like that. So we've developed an algorithm, again, with great support and data sharing from various NEI-funded projects on ROP screening, and developed an algorithm that works really well in terms of diagnosing plus disease, which is a hallmark of the disease. We've also shown that using this algorithm, we can develop a severity scale score that can then be used to essentially look at who requires treatment, how the progression of disease changes over the course, and to identify where one might want to treat, for instance. In all of these cases, one of the biggest challenge we run into is this notion of what they call portability challenge, where typically what happens when you're training a machine learning algorithms, you have a data set, you might split it up into a training set, a validation set, and a test set. And that's a fairly common way of in which people do this. You might do cross-validation, but typically, again, you have a training data set, a validation data set, and a test set. And then the test set the algorithm has never seen the set-aside test set, and one hopes that the performance of the algorithm and the test set is an indication of how well it will work in the wild. Unfortunately, very often what we find is that the performance on this set-aside test set that's from the same distribution does not really guarantee how well it's going to perform on external data sets. And those external data sets might be coming from different institutions, from different populations. For instance, we trained our algorithm using data from the US, most of which is Caucasian babies. Now we're going to try to apply it in India or Nepal or other places. And so we really need to make sure that these algorithms are portable across devices, regions, and so on. And even more challenging is the fact that if you have a single training data set from one institution and you test it on one external test set, how well it performs on that external test set really does not indicate how well it might perform on a second or a third or a fourth test set. So they don't generalize well, and just adding 2 or 3 external data sets doesn't necessarily guarantee that they'll work on a completely different distribution as well. Here's an example from cervical cancer. What they observed, this was data from Dr. Schiffman at NCI. Basically, you train on one set, you have very good case control discrimination, but when you apply it on an external test set, you see very poor behavior. And you can see in this matrix where when you train and test in the same test set, you have excellent performance. When you look at the off-diagonal elements, meaning you trained on one test set and you tested on something else, you get very poor performance. If you did have access to everything together, then you get great performance on both. And we see exactly the same thing in mammography, for instance. Here's a breast density algorithm. We had data from 3 different scanner types. Again, we were very fortunate to get access to this large NIH-funded data set, the DMIS data set. And so we can see that they were acquired on different scanners with different intensity profiles. And when you train and test on the same data set, which is the diagonal elements, you get great performance. On the off-diagonal elements, you get awful performance. And it's very different. Just because you get this performance on trained on scanner 1 and on scanner 3 and tested on scanner 2 doesn't mean that you know what it's going to look like for this off-diagonal elements. If you look at things like t-SNEs or UMAPs, which look at the clustering of the layers, the features of the last but one layer, for instance, you see what the network is doing is actually learning these different scanner types first, and then within each scanner type, it's learning the pathology. And that means that this, the generalization, which we're hoping the network is doing in terms of putting everything in the same space, doesn't really happen as well as we hoped. And there's a lot of work happening in to try to improve that in the computer science domain, and we really hope that we'll get to a place where we can sort of mitigate some of these issues. So one answer is, let's put a central database, and that has been phenomenally successful in many, many domains in medicine. We've had the Cancer Imaging Archive, which has been an amazing resource for the cancer imaging community, something we've taken a lot of advantage of. MIDRIC is another data set. Some institutions like Stanford have been very generous in making their data sets available as well. So they've made multiple data sets available. Challenges put on by organizations like RSNA and ACR, again, make many of these these data sets publicly available. And that again helps us to evaluate and solve, try to address and understand some of these limitations and how best ways to mitigate against that. So going back to the breast density, you can again see that on-diagonal elements have great performance. The off-diagonal elements had poor performance, but when we put it all together, we can train an algorithm that works well. There are many challenges with this notion of a central repository. There's a lot of resources needed. Resources are needed for de-identification. One of the concerns that many NIH-funded grantees have is that during the duration of the grant, NIH might support the creation and sharing of the data, but what happens once a grant is over? How do we continue to support making the data publicly available? There's a concern from many institutions, companies, and others where the value of the data is so high that sharing is a challenge. There's a lot of technical and logistical challenges around moving around large data sets. In addition to all of those, there's a notion of harmonization, and the standards that had been mentioned previously is we need to have standards. If you're going to aggregate data sets from multiple resources, we need to make sure that the metadata are harmonized, the imaging data are harmonized. We have good ways to map all of the metadata from the different sources. And again, this cannot really be stressed enough, is that if we want to do AI on large data sets, and we really, really need multi-institutional data sets, we also need to focus on the tools that allow the creation of these multi-institutional data sets, including anonymization, harmonization, things like that. Another approach that ACR, for instance, the American College of Radiology is looking at is this notion of distributed validation. So I say I created an algorithm, I know how well it works on my data. Can I now give it to somebody else to test it on their data without them having to ship their data to me? So the ACR AI Lab, for instance, is one approach that allows me to share my algorithm with somebody else and have them run it on their internal data that is within their institutional firewall. Other approaches are things like federated learning and distributed learning. So there's this notion is that certainly having a central repository is wonderful, but there may be challenges in making that happen. Patient privacy is a primary challenge, and the anonymization burden is not small. And this becomes especially true because we need a lot of metadata. What tends to happen very often when we say that we need to share data is people will share the data in a not very useful manner. And data without the metadata can be quite not just useless, but can be harmful, as we saw from the COVID example. So in order to really have this rich resource of data, we need a lot of the metadata that can be very hard to anonymize, for instance. Patient notes are really impossible to anonymize in a sense, but if there are ways in which we can access these data sets without necessarily having to put them in a central repository, maybe that we can again push the field forward by allowing the algorithms to see these multi-institutional data sets without necessarily having to do the data sharing. So there's many ways in which people have explored this. Model ensembling is a a fairly straightforward one. Each one takes their own model based on their own data, and you share your model and you create essentially an ensemble of that. The federated learning is probably the most classic version of this distributed learning approach, where essentially, and we'll go into that in a second, but we are able to learn from multi-institutional data sets where no data is leaving the institution, just the model weights. So the model weights are shared between institutions and potentially with the central server. The central server may do some aggregation, and this training happens until we reach some convergence point. The other variations on the themes are things like cyclical learning. I train my model, I send it to you. You train your model, send it to your colleague, and we again go on in this fashion until we achieve some kind of a convergence. Here we don't, the difference being we don't have a central server. There are other new variants, things like swarm learning. Split learning is another example. And all of these allow, again, us to learn data from multi-institutional data sets without data sharing. So in model ensembling, we each train a model, we send it to a central server, there's some aggregation of the parameters, and we get performance. In federated learning, this, as mentioned, you start off with a untrained model that's sent to all of the local hospitals. Each one has their own data and labels, they train it locally. They push back their model weights to a central parameter server. The model, that server does some aggregation, sends back the weights for local training, which happens again, and this process continues. There's many considerations technically from the use of non-IID data, unbalanced data sets, and again, a very active research area. But potentially an interesting approach for us in the medical field, where the data sets tend to be very, have a lot of concerns about data sharing and privacy. And this might allow us to potentially reduce some of the burden around that data sharing approach. So here was a example from the breast density. It was one of the first sort of real life examples of federated learning. This was done across 7 sites. And we showed again that we can get really good performance. We get essentially as good, almost as good as having all of the data in a central location without the need for data sharing. And here we saw vastly different distribution of labels. We saw a lot of difference in heterogeneity in terms of the sample size and the prevalence and so on. And despite all of that, we were able to train a data set that worked well. There was a large study by some colleagues across the globe actually for COVID and literally spanned the globe. And they again did federated learning for COVID and showed that they were able to train a model that works well. In ophthalmology, in ROP, working again with Pete Campbell and Dr. Chang, we've been able to show that we can do federated learning across sites. And this was data from the IROP consortium. We had data from multiple institutions, and the data was sufficiently, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the data. There's heterogeneity in the size of the data. There's heterogeneity in the prevalence of different labels. There's heterogeneity in the quality of the labels. So each site also provided we had access to both a central read as well as some local data. And so the ability to learn from these geographically and disparate data sets was quite encouraging. We saw that we were able to get a model that is essentially as good as having to have a central database using federated learning. And even though we saw that local models may not have worked as well, by being part of this consortium, we are able to get a model that works well on their local data. The interesting thing also is in diseases like ROP, essentially what we find is that we may not have enough data at a single institution to train a good model. And we really need to come together as a community to train some of these more robust models. And this is especially a challenge for more rare diseases. So there's a lot of opportunity for approaches like federated learning in a variety of healthcare scenarios. And I think if, as a community, we can get together and do that, that would be great. So cyclical training, as mentioned before, is essentially go across and train. In split learning, it's another approach to this distributed collaborative learning approach, where instead of having to aggregate at the central site, you essentially split your network such that the input and the front of the network remain on the client side. You have a central server that has a middle part of it, and then the labels in the back part of the network are on the client side again. And again, we can show that this approach works quite well. So in terms of logistical considerations, we need to have a consortium with willing participants. We need to agree on the clinical problem. The metadata we need to really agree on and harmonize on. The architecture, the annotations, the infrastructure, and how do we communicate in a secure fashion between sites. Another thing to think about a lot, and this comes up a lot, is the IP and publication strategy. If we end up with a model that is good across institutions, how does the IP get split up, and how do you value a data point? So there's this whole other research area on data valuation, but there is this a need for thinking about how to give a monetary or other value to a single data point as we are working in this collaborative way. There's a lot of technical considerations in terms of what method are we going to use? Are we using split learning or federated learning, something else? How do you ensure that the central model is going to work? Do we need to do something else to get it work? And there's a number of open source resources available out there that if you're interested in federated learning, I would highly encourage you to explore them. NVFLAIR is something that, as part of the MONAI and other working groups you're working with, and that allows you to very easily set up federated learning across clients. There's privacy and security considerations, and there's many ways to think about that as well in terms of differential privacy or homomorphic encryption. And what assumptions can you make? You assume that everybody who's in your consortium is a honest and well-meaning person, or do you assume that there's going to be bad actors and you have to sort of guard against the worst case hypothetical scenario of bad actors? And where do you want to be in this the spectrum between extremely secure, extremely private, potentially at the cost of some performance? Another concern that comes up a lot, I mean, this is the good part of it, AI seems to sometimes have superhuman capabilities. It can do things like predict your cardiovascular risk from fundus photographs. It can do all kinds of things from looking at your eye, which is wonderful for those of us who like to look at images from the eye. And it might be a way for opportunistic screening in terms of looking at your risk for all kinds of diseases based on what your eyes look like. It can also do things like predicting risk of breast cancer 1 to 5 years from a mammogram today where there's no sign of cancer. And typically humans are not able to do these tasks. So the potential to do these sort of things that are not readily accessible to humans, so this algorithms is very powerful. But the concern is that they're often not transparent. There's a risk of bias. There's this is a study that just came out yesterday or the day before, where they showed that an AI algorithm can be trained to look at a chest X-ray and predict the self-reported race of a patient. What does that even mean? How is it doing that? Similarly, colleagues at OHSU, Aaron Koiner and others have shown that you can look at grayscale retinal maps and again predict self-reported race. So what does that sort of opens up all kinds of questions and really highlights the need for vigilance, especially as we are really hoping that we can make these data sets public. So thinking about this balance between the value of these data sets and some of the hidden risks, I think it's an open discussion. None of this work that we do would be possible without the access to data. All of the work that we do, most of it is on public data sets. Some of it is on data sets created by our clinical collaborators. We almost never generate our data. So from my perspective, we need lots and lots of data, but we, I think, should sort of go into it with a good perspective in terms of what and how we're making these data sets available, especially the questions about metadata. How do we make sure that we are doing this in a way that's safe? And so there's, again, lots and lots of opportunities for healthcare. And building these models requires access to well-annotated, well-curated data sets. But I really think we cannot emphasize enough the need for constant vigilance and unintended and unexpected ways in which bias can creep in. Federated learning and other methods like that are a great technical approach to having models that are learning from multi-institutional data sets, which is really important, without the need for data sharing. So I'm really hoping that as a field, we can continue to explore this further. And finally, I would like to thank our lab without, again, we have a wonderful lab of a very diverse lab. We get students from all high school students all the way to junior faculty, and we've been very fortunate in getting a diverse group. And this group helps me sort of think constantly about both the advantages and some of the risks as we sort of march forward in using AI in healthcare. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jashri. That was a great presentation. I think there's a lot of questions coming in, but for those of you who haven't submitted any questions, there's a Slido link, and feel welcome to upvote certain questions. I'm going to start with one. This is hosted by the NIH. So question is, are centralized NIH supported domain-specific repositories one solution for sharing data and algorithms? I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for sure that would be phenomenal. I mean, the NIH has supported many of them, the Cancer Imaging Archive and MIDRIC, some of these. But I think thinking about an ecosystem where you can share data in a secure manner, support different models of data sharing, facilitate all the tools for data harmonization and metadata sharing as well, I think would be great, and algorithm sharing as well. It's not trivial because everyone is concerned about the risk, about bad actors, about a variety of things. And so how to set up this ecosystem. But I think more than anybody else, NIH is better positioned to do that than individual researchers. And I think if we want to continue to take advantage of the enormous amount of data that NIH funded research is generating, then we need to make sure we also support the infrastructure needed to keep it sort of going and cleaning it up and curating it and so on. So absolutely, as a NIH grantee, I would say 100% this is something NIH should be doing. So.
That's the right answer. No, I'm joking. So kind of a tail on that one, there's other question about the federated learning approaches. So in addition to sharing the data, I know you mentioned the algorithms and models, but what kind of infrastructure might the NIH be able to, create or support to increase the federated learning?
My biased answer is absolutely, I think that would be phenomenal, because I really think that you might get a more rich data set by allowing for federated learning to happen. But the data are not leaving institutional firewalls, where you can get access to a lot more metadata that are much harder to anonymize. By facilitating NIH-wide federated learning networks, I think not only will you get access, and making it easy, you might get a lot more data from across the country. One thing that has been noticed is a lot of the AI algorithms are based on data that just come from the coast, essentially from sort of California and Massachusetts and sort of the coast. And we get almost no AI algorithms coming from the rest of the country. And so by doing federated learning approaches where you can incentivize the whole country and globe to participate, I think you'll get a much more representative and diverse data set that is helpful. So absolutely, again, biased answer, but yes.
Do you have thoughts on how to incentivize the research community to work in harmonization and de-identifying data? It's a tough one.
Tough one. Yes, we need to definitely do that. I think one thing we've seen is when people make data resources publicly available, those tend to get cited actually quite really well. I think some of my best cited papers are public data sources, public code. So I think there is actually inbuilt incentives in terms of some of that. But the harmonization tends to be sort of not fun work. And the same with a lot of the plumbing that is required to make this happen. A lot of that requires really hard work, but it's the people who are doing that work don't necessarily benefit from the success of that work. And so I'm really not sure how to incentivize that. I'm hoping that NIH has some answers.
Yeah, I think most data scientists say it takes 80%
more
to clean up the data.
Way more. Yeah, so exactly. And the thing is, you don't need to do it multiple times, right? If somebody's already gone through the effort of cleaning it, then we can sort of build on the shoulders of those people. And trying to say that everybody has to go through the same process of cleaning again and again, and slightly different ways, I think is not the most useful way for the community to go forward.
Yeah. I'll just add to that. I think sometimes that also introduces its own bias, right? Different ways of imputing.
Exactly, yes.
Can you speak to some of the AI bias in retinal images and ways to mitigate these?
I'm sorry? Yes. That is a really good question. I mean, certainly fundus photographs have a lot of information about sort of pigmentation, if nothing else. So looking at a fundus image, it's relatively easy to classify self-reported rays. And what we had hoped was that if we did things like segmentation, that we would potentially mitigate against some of that. And unfortunately, what you're finding is that is really, we haven't succeeded in doing that completely. So there continues to be information in a segmented retinal image that continues to have information about self-reported rays for what it's worth. We're trying to figure out how to, where that's coming from. Is it sort of biological? Is it more artifact of the image processing algorithm that we are using? So work in progress. Fundus photographs have tremendous information. They can tell you about the age, they can tell you about cardiovascular risk, they can tell you if somebody's a smoker. So it has a lot of information, and some of it is associated in ways that are very hard to, the confounding there can be very hard to get rid of. So I'm not sure I have a great answer. I just know that it's an important question that I think we need a lot of the people who are interested in this to come together to work on it.
Yeah, some more research in that area to figure out why.
Yeah, I think, again, NIH can do a lot in terms of supporting research in these potentially uncomfortable topics about how bias can creep in AI. I mean, along with all of the good that AI has a potential to do, and it has a lot of potential, we have to be somewhat cognizant of the potential for harm as well. And so just making sure that we're doing good.
There's one question about successful models of neuropsychology based on fMRI for other images. Do you have any input on?
Yeah, that's for data sharing, or yeah.
Successful models based on fMRI?
I mean, I don't know that I know the full scope of what's available there, but there certainly the brain imaging community has been another one that has embraced data sharing widely. There's been many NIH funded and other efforts to make brain data available really broadly, including fMRI and other data sets. And most of the image analysis tools for brain image analysis, like FreeSurfer or others, are all open source and have been NIH supported open source tools that have been around for 20 plus years. So I think NIH there has been a lot of work in developing open models, open tools, open models, open data sets, open standards in the brain imaging field as well. So.
Awesome, thank you. I know we're just about out of time, so I want to heed the floor to Susan in case you want to take us out.
Thank you so very, very much, Dr. Kapathy-Kramer. This was a really exciting talk. I'd love to follow up on some of your ideas about AI bias, particularly in retinal images. It's just fantastic, and all of your work in federated learning. With this, I want to thank our participants, and thank you so much, Carrie, for hosting today. I can't wait to see everybody next June on the 10th for Dr. Rosa Alcazar's discussion on increasing data science diversity through the work supported by the Human Genome Research Institute. And have a wonderful afternoon, and happy Friday the 13th.
Thanks for having me.
Staying safe. Thanks, Jayashree.